Hey class, today we're going to be looking at our section 1.3 day 1 notes for AP Stats. We're going to be looking at different ways of displaying our quantitative data using the graphing calculator. I'm going to be using the TI graphing calculator, TI-84 emulator here on my screen. So if you have a graphing calculator, please get that ready. And we will just kind of run through. I'm having some technical issues, so we're just going to run through the calculator pieces on the video, and you can copy in the rest of the notes from our notes key on our course calendar. All right, so we are going to start with example 1. So here's our notes for today, displaying and summarizing quantitative data. We're going to start with this example here. Students in a biology class recorded the heights in centimeters of plants for an experiment. Data is summarized in the table below. So the first thing I want you to do with your calculators is hit the Stat button. And then the first one says Edit. You're going to hit Enter, and it's going to bring you into these lists. Now, I've already put the numbers into my list number 1. So right now you'll want to pause the video and get all the numbers from that table into your list. Now that you have your numbers in the list, what we want to do is create a histogram. So we're going to go second and then the y equals button. If we do second y equals, it'll bring us to our stat plots. And I can get to a lot of my statistical graphs from there. So I'm going to hit enter to go into my first plot and make sure it's on. And then I can use my arrow keys and go down to the one that looks like a histogram and select it by pressing enter. Make sure that wherever you put your list, so right now our list is in L1, or mine is, so I'm going to make sure that this says L1. If you need to change that, we can get to the different lists if we press second and then the number keys. But for right now, that's what I need. All right, so then we're going to graph it. And when we graph it, I'm going to hit zoom stat, which is zoom and then the 9th button, and it'll bring me to a histogram that looks like this. Now, this looks great. It looks like a histogram, but unfortunately, the intervals are going to be a little unnatural. And what I mean by that, if you hit the trace button, you can see that this first interval are the plants that grew to a height between 32 and 40.6 centimeters. If I were making this histogram by hand, I wouldn't be doing 32 to 40.6 centimeters. I would probably do 30 to 40. So we can change our intervals to be something more like what we would have done by hand. And it's pretty important that we do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the window button. And we can change them right here. So I'm going to make my minimum 30. And my max, if this is telling me my max is 83.6, I'm just going to go, since I'm going to count by tens, I'm going to go to 90. And then my X scale, this is how much I want the interval width to be. I want the width to be 10, so counting by tens all the way through. We don't need to worry about our Y min or max or scale. That's fine. The Y scale at 1 is always nice. And then I'm going to hit graph again, and I can see it's slightly different. It's relatively the same shape as it was before. But now if I hit trace, it's a really nice little interval, and I'm going to need to draw this on my paper. So it's just easier and it feels more natural. So trace will give you a lot of information. First, it'll tell you where to start and stop your intervals. It also reminds you, and there's a note in our notes on this, that each interval includes the minimum and does not include the maximum value. So if you look down here, it says minimum equals 30, but the max is less than 40. So it doesn't actually include 40. If there was a plant that was exactly 40 centimeters tall, that would actually be counted in the second interval. And then we can hit our arrow keys and go through the rest of the intervals to see them. Now the n equals is our frequency. So this first one, n equals 3, tells me that there are 3 plants that have a height between 30 and less than 40. There are 7 plants that have a height between 40 and less than 50, and so forth. So when you draw this histogram on your papers, a couple things. Make sure you number your axis. Make sure your histogram looks like this. It's nice and neat. Doesn't have to be perfect, but try to make it pretty close. And then you do need to label your axes. So the horizontal axis, you want to tell me what those numbers represent. I would label it with, let's see, I would say something like heights in centimeters of plants. And then the vertical axis is going to be titled frequency. Frequency just means how many times did it happen. So, and that's going to be your, I'm just going to start with 0 and count all the way up to at least 7 because that's my highest frequency value. But you do want to label that vertical axis as frequency. And then that's our histogram. So that's how to do a histogram on our calculator. You can always rewind the video and watch it again and practice. The next thing we're going to do is go over, so our next type of graph is a stem and leaf graph. So we're going to use the same numbers from example 1, which is convenient. But unfortunately, if we go to second and y equals to look at what our plot options are, hit enter, there's nothing here that represents a stem and leaf plot. So we can't have the calculator do it for us. But what we can do is go back to stat and see this second option. It says sort A. Enter that. And then my list is in L1. So I'm going to press second and 1 to give me L1. I'm going to close my parentheses and hit enter. And it's going to tell me, okay, done. I did it for you. What that means is I'm sorting it in ascending order. So if I go back to stat and go into edit, my first list is now written in numerical order from lowest to highest, which is so useful when we're making our stem and leaf plots and our dot plots, really, and almost any plot. It's kind of nice to have these sorted so that you can see exactly. Here's the 3 plants that had a height between 30 and less than 40 that we saw. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plants that were between 40 and less than 50. So you can see where those numbers are coming from and what they mean. When we're making our stem and leaf plot, this is really helpful. Again, you can look at the notes, the note key on the calendar that's filled in to see how to build that stem and leaf plot on that example. But this is pretty much the only calculator piece that would really help us on that. All right, our last one we're going to look at is how to do the dot plot in our calculator. And unfortunately, again, they don't have, if I go to second and y equals and into my stat plots, there's no dot plot here. Now you might be thinking this looks like a dot plot, but that's actually a scatter plot when we have an x and a y variable. We'll get to that later. That's not what we're doing right now. The only 2 graphical displays for a single variable that we have are histograms and box and whisker plots. So anything else, you're kind of just going to have to do by hand, but the sorting definitely helps. So here we have data. We have new set of data. So pause your video and type in those numbers into stat, edit, and then you can replace your L1 numbers with those numbers. I actually typed it into L2 just so I would have both lists available to me. So pause your video, type it into whatever list you want to type it into. And then now that we have our list typed in, again, because our calculator won't do it for us, really the only calculator piece that'll help is doing a sort. So I'm going to go back to stat, go down to sort A. This time I'm going to sort second and 2 for my L2. And then it's done. So now if I go back into stat and edit, I can see that it's been sorted. The other thing with the dot plot, as you'll see, is you kind of have to have each individual, it's not intervals like we have with the histogram, or really even the stem plot, we kind of do in intervals. Here you're going to have on your horizontal axis every number represented. And so it takes a little longer to set that up, but you'll see that example in our notes. I definitely prefer the histogram and the stem and leaf plot, but it's nice to know all of our options. Always make sure that you label your horizontal and vertical axes with context. So what do those numbers represent? Make sure to put that on your horizontal axis. And then actually for a dot plot, we don't have a vertical axis. So when you're building your dots, make sure that they're lined up vertically and spaced equally. so that you can kind of see that height and that shape of your distribution. Right, and I think that just about does it for our calculator help for this lesson.